listening to The Trauma Beat, hosted by me, Tamara Cherry. Check the show notes for anything that might activate your own trauma responses. And as always, like, subscribe, leave a comment, do what you can if you like what you hear. Episode 11, my conversation with mass violence survivor, Brett Holzhauer. So, Brett, why don't you just start out by introducing yourself?
Yeah, my name's Brett Holzhauer. I'm 28 years old. I now live in South Florida, originally from Southern California. I'm a reporter for CNBC Select. I write about personal finance, investing, anything that has to do with Americans and their money. Love the job that I do. Grew up playing water polo. I played water polo in high school and college. Love being at the beach, love Mexican food. And I have a pretty unique life story to add on top of it.
Okay, so the water polo thing we mentioned just offline, that's something you and I have in common, and I love that. I always I'm trying to tell my kids, explain to them, because one of them, I gave them one of my old water polo trophies, explain to them like how tough their mom is. And I don't think they appreciate it yet, but Brett, I know that you appreciate it.
Yes, not just yet, but they'll get it. Some people are like, "Oh, is there a horse involved? Like, can you walk on the bottom of the pool?"
Yeah, horse involved.
It's one of the toughest sports in the world, so it takes a unique individual.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Brett, you mentioned your unique life story. How about you just start out by telling us a little bit about your narrative, what you're comfortable sharing in terms of what brought you to me, to reaching out to me on Twitter and having this conversation.
Definitely. So to kind of wrap it all together. So I was involved in a school shooting on June 7th, 2013. It was my last day of junior college, ironically enough. And to kind of paint the backstory, I come from a, American conservative family. I was raised around firearms. I grew up around guns, never really bothered me, definitely supportive of people's right to bear arms, to kind of put that all together. So graduate high school, go to junior college. It's my last day. I'm in the library studying, doing my thing, getting ready for my very last final. Very, very last final. So the shooting was around 12:30. My test was around 3:30. I was going to finish my test and walk off campus and be done. So I'm sitting in the library studying with a few friends, and all of a sudden I heard one bang. And I kind of looked around. Someone dropped a textbook. Something else happened. And all of a sudden I heard repeated gunshots. And again, I know what repeated gunshots sound like. So I immediately grabbed this girl that was sitting next to me, literally threw her in this private study room. And there was a bunch of kids cowering on the floor. I shut the door and I looked at everyone. I said, "Guys, everyone be quiet, shut up. Everyone call 911. We're going to be okay." And really where that calmness in that moment came from is that I was trained actually as an LA County lifeguard. And so you're trained to kind of handle those moments as non-emotionally as possible. And so 20, 30 minutes go by, a few more gunshots ring out, and then a police officer with a key comes in, unlocks the door, pushes the door open. I'm the first one at the door, and he points a gun straight in my face, probably 4 or 5 feet away from me, and he says, "Everyone put your hands up. We don't know who you are." And everyone's screaming, crying, and I just, with a coldest face, I said, "Officer, we're students, get us out of here." And so he said, "Everyone get on the floor and crawl out." So we left our belongings behind and we crawled probably 100 feet to the stairwell. We ran out the front entrance of the library. All of the library doors were glass completely blown out. There were very literally hundreds of rounds spilled out in the foyer of the library. We run out on the steps. There's blood everywhere. And then we're running out to Pearl Street. And we're almost to a safe spot where all of the media was at the time. And I heard an officer yell, "Don't look, don't look, don't look." Of course I looked. And there was the shooter's body, deceased, full tactical gear, looked like a guy out of, a video game basically. And of course everyone's wailing, freaking out. And I was just in the zone. I was in fight or flight mode, to get to a safe area. And of course I see all of the media there. And that was kind of the end of the actual event itself before I kind of put my reporter hat on to go out and tell my story.
So tell me about that, your reporter hat, because you were a journalism student, right?
Yes. Yeah. So I was in my second year of journalism, and I knew at 5 years old I was going to be a news anchor. It's the only thing I've ever wanted to do. It's a pretty cute story, but I knew in that moment, once I had kind of caught my breath and taken a deep breath, that I knew I had a story to tell, and I had an obligation to do that. And I had one reporter approach me. I think it was from ABC7 in LA, and she said, "Hey, do you want to do an interview?" And I wasn't in that calm space yet. I said, "Ma'am, I'm a journalism student. I get it. Let me take a breath for a second." And then after a minute or so, I'm like, you know what? It's time to do this. And so I approached that reporter again. I gave one interview, one turned to 2 to 5 to 7 to 10. And I forget the exact count, but I think in a 2-hour span, I probably did 35 interviews approximately from networks all over the country. And I was very literally getting pulled like by my arm. Okay, you're done with this one. Go to this one, go to this one, go to this one. Because I was the only rational student that could get in front of a camera and explain what had just happened. And yeah, it was pretty crazy to say the least.
So in this blog post that you wrote, I believe it was 5 years after the shooting, you had written a blog post about that day. And in it, you said that when that first reporter approached you, you weren't ready to talk. Can you expand on that? Like where your mind was? I know that you were thinking as a journalism student, I have a story to tell. I have an obligation to tell it. But what did you mean by not being ready to talk in that moment?
I mean, I was sprinting. So number one, I was just out of breath, but also I needed to take a minute to process what had just happened and get my facts straight and basically not overstate what had just happened. So one of the things that I received some flack for when the initial interviews came out, actually from my own family, is, oh, were there really hundreds of rounds of ammunition? Like, were you exaggerating because you were in the moment? And sure enough, the reports came out and there were hundreds of rounds. Wow. So I wasn't just imagining things, So I just wanted to make sure I took a breath, caught my breath, made sure I thought through the story, what just happened, so that way I could give the best objectionable story of what had just occurred to make sure that this was told correctly.
Why did you feel that it was your civic duty to share right away?
I think, so number one, being a journalism student, you have an obligation to tell stories, I believe. And then also, not that in 2013, we were at the height of this hysteria of mass shootings in schools, but, obviously Columbine had happened in 1999. There were other ones leading up to the one that I was in. And I knew that there was a level of hysteria and, I hate to say it, but blowing things out of proportion in some cases, I'll clarify. And so, and also, being putting my reporter hat away for a second, being someone that is, pro Second Amendment and believes in the right to bear arms, I wanted to make sure that this story was told as closely to perfect as possible. And to weigh in on that just for a second, not to get too deep into politics, but it came out later in the reports that this gunman had documented severe mental health issues, went and applied for a gun license in California, which is notoriously one of the strictest states for gun laws and gun restrictions. And he was denied. And so he decided on his own accord to go ahead and manufacture and engineer a gun from scratch. And so that part of it too, again, coming from a political perspective, I don't think is reported on enough. Of course, with the recent ones, we've seen, oh, hey, he went and purchased the gun legally several hours before or a couple days later. But then let's also tell the other side of it that doesn't always happen. Some people will go to the ends of the earth to hurt other people. And the example I give is the Boston bombings. There were pressure cookers. You can get them at your local retailer. So, I think, again, we need to tell all angles of why did this person do this? How did they acquire these things? Was it legally? Was it illegally? And be fair to both sides, of the argument.
So, Brett, I wanted to get to this a little bit later, but because we're talking about it now, it might be better to dive in. One of the things that I often hear from mass violence survivors in particular, and really a lot of trauma survivors talking about different stories in the media, is that they're impacted by the media coverage of other similar events. So what you were just talking about in terms of the conversations around politics and everything, does that have an impact on you when these other mass violence events happen and you start hearing those conversations? Would you like these stories to be covered differently?
Absolutely. I mean, it definitely weighs on me. With the most recent one in Uvalde, Texas, I was down for the count for a day or two. I was just in this lull of sadness, for these poor families. And in terms of how we need to talk about it, actually, one more time. Can you repeat the question so I make sure I
So
answer it?
just in terms of what the impact is of other media coverage of other mass violence incidents, and do you think we need to be journalists need to be covering these stories differently? Like, does the impact, the conversations, the politics, the gun stuff, does that impact you negatively? Do you think that we should be talking about things differently? Or, I mean, we can open that question wide up in general, what you think about the media coverage of these cases.
I think that there is, again, I can only relate to the incident that I was in. I think that there's this mass land grab of who was there, who can we talk to, who can we get a hot quote from, and then everyone just kind of throws up their hands like, okay, thanks for the help, see you later. And there's never a follow-up. However, and I had sent you this over email, the Wall Street Journal article talking about mass shooter or mass violence survivors and how their lives are impacted 5 years later, 10 years later, 15 years later. And transparently, I had reached out to the producer of the Anderson Cooper show that I was on, when my school shooting had happened. And I've reached out to her, on my own accord saying, hey, like, how can I help? I was on your show and I've never received a response. So it doesn't seem like there's really a care of how are these people doing? What's going on in their lives now? How have their opinions changed? Because, being 9 years removed now from, even coming from a household that is pro firearm possession, going through a mass shooting, and then now being 28 years old, a full grown adult, with a house and hoping to start a family, my firearm thoughts and processes definitely have changed. So I think there's a lack of follow-up. It's just in the moment, let's get this now, get it now, and then let's move on.
That is such an interesting point, and I'm so happy you brought it up, Brett. I've heard that sentiment so many times in so many different ways. The feeling of journalists coming in and taking, and then sort of just discarding the survivor and moving on to the next thing. And it seems that there's like a feeling of being forgotten, being abandoned, being used. Does that sound relatable to you? Like those?
I would say somewhat, yes. Again, I'm putting my journalism hat on. Is it my responsibility as a journalist to keep tabs on former sources? And the answer is no. That's not my job. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a trained therapist. I got what I needed, and it's time to move on to the next story. But when I take my journalist hat off and I put my human hat on, there should be some sort of follow-up, especially when in a moment of like true hurt and vulnerability, I gave you something that you needed, like scratch my back a little bit, like help me out, give me resources, follow up with me, see how I'm doing, even from a human element, and then also a storytelling element. If this producer from CNN reached out to me and said, hey, I got your message, I'd love to tell your story again and see where you're at, I would totally be, apt for that. So yeah, I think there's got to be a better way for these really tragic events to be covered. And not to say that my school shooting is equal to 9/11, but we've actively, as journalists, followed up with 9/11 victims and survivors, and continue to tell those stories. So I don't see, why we couldn't do that for these, very impactful events.
That's such an interesting point. The fact that, and I mean, this is something that the media tends to do, right? I've heard the term hierarchy so many times, like in this research project, that a lot of people think that the public or the media creates like a hierarchy. They create a hierarchy of victims and survivors of one shooting, for example, or one mass violence incident, but then they also create a hierarchy of different events. So some survivors are left to feel like, well, our story isn't as important because only 2 people died in ours versus 20 people at this other one, So it's really interesting to hear you say that. And in terms of the follow-up, like it's really fascinating to have this conversation with you, a journalist, because I have been grappling with these things too. Like, I think back on my career, I was a crime reporter for close to 15 years. I have no idea how many trauma survivors I interviewed, how many hundreds I would have interviewed in that span of time. And I never remember following up with somebody. Like, first, I always kind of felt like I would be intruding if I were to call, but really my reasoning for calling would be to get something else, like to do another story or to get another interview. There was never a moment there where I felt like, okay, I should call and see how they're doing after giving me that huge emotional thing.
You don't want to double dip is essentially what you're saying.
You don't. Yeah. But it shouldn't be like, I think that the reason I felt so icky about that is because I knew I was continuing to take from them. when really I'm realizing now that I should have just been following up as a human being to say, how are you doing after giving me that huge emotional part of you? And I just left you like, how are you doing now? Like I kind of left you in an awful state.
And I think you bring up a good point. If we were to approach it from the human element of actually, hey Joe, hey Sally, how are you doing? And if that conversation loops into, I want to do something with this, then maybe something can be made out of that for, again, the greater good.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why with the event that I went through, and even with the personal beliefs that I still hold, I still think it's extremely important to tell this story, not only for mass shooting survivors, but also for people out there that are having difficulty with their views. I know several gun owners specifically that at this point are like, I think I'm ready to give these things up. It's just not worth it anymore. It's not worth it on my conscience. And then also the other way of, I don't believe in guns at all, but it's getting so bad now that I have no choice but to defend myself. So there's both conversations happening. And again, for me as a reporter, and also as someone with my own personal set of beliefs, it's a very difficult position to be in, especially with the circumstance of someone creating a weapon from scratch. How do you regulate that? And the answer is you don't. So, it's a difficult position to be in, but I want there to be a rational, non-politically charged space and arena for people to go out there and talk about this crappy situation that they've been in, and just talk about their emotions without saying, oh, if we had more gun regulation, that would have never happened. Like that, it gets to this politically charged motion that people just throw their hands up and say, you know what, we're just gonna have to agree to disagree and walk away.
Do you think that journalists, like in the immediate aftermath of these traumatic events, they are seeking out people to say either this shows that we need to get rid of guns, or this shows that we don't need to? Like they're trying to put people into boxes when that might not be the conversations that people are wanting to have?
Here's an interesting thought, and this is coming to fruition now. What if I would have gotten in front of those cameras and said, you know what, if I had a firearm on me legally that day with a concealed carry license, I would have tried to defend myself? How would have that gone? That's an interesting question. And I'm not aiming it one way or the other, but is that the conversation that people are willing to have? I don't know. So yeah, the conversations, with these poor parents, I pray for them every single day in Texas. I'm sure the first thing going through your head is, why does this 18-year-old kid have a gun? We need to outlaw these things. I get it. I totally get it. But then once the dust settles, and then we have to, again, look at our rights as Americans and also reflect within ourselves, where do those conversations go? I don't know. It's difficult. It really, really is difficult. I don't have the answer as someone that still stands as, pro firearm purchasing and concealed carry and all of that. But, I've had my own second thoughts about it. I should, and to go down the road of politics, should an 18-year-old kid be have the right to own an AR-15? I don't know. I really don't know.
Brett, are you comfortable going a little bit more into the day that your shooting happened? I want to ask you about, tell me if I'm going anywhere that makes you uncomfortable, but you just told us a few moments ago that you could have given like 35 or so interviews in a 2-hour time span. Can you tell me, if you recall, what happened after that? Because you described in your blog post walking home, leaving this crime scene where your car was parked within this crime scene. You couldn't get your car and you were walking home and people were honking and waving at you, presumably having just seen you on TV. What was that like? Because you described this like 15 minutes of fame, quote unquote. Like, what was that like, having just experienced this hugely traumatic event and then having people like recognize you on the street because of it, like right after?
Truthfully, I hated it because it was such a tragic, horrific, traumatic event. It wasn't something happy. If I won, an Olympic medal and people were recognizing me because I was on TV, great. I would have loved that. But I was walking home. All of my stuff was on campus because it was an active crime scene. And I'm walking home. I literally just have my cell phone on me, this little 19-year-old kid. And I'm processing everything. I have work in a couple of days. I have to call my boss. I have to call these people. Like, so much was running through my head that like, it just made me sad. I literally walked home with like my head between my shoulders. It was just a very sad walk home. It was about 2.5 miles. Definitely gave me some time to breathe through everything. But once I got home, I just broke down. Like I just had an absolute meltdown because then I was able to be by myself and really understand what I just went through. And yeah, for the next couple of days, I got recognized. Like if I was going to the grocery store, a few people, waved or like pointed, but I didn't want to be recognized as, oh, you're the kid from the Santa Monica College shooting. Like, with, most notably the Parkland shooting, a few of those kids that were very, into the politics of this afterwards, they're extremely recognizable. I mean, they have millions of followers on social media now, and that's what they're known for. And is that a good thing? For me, absolutely not. I don't want people to recognize me on the street. Oh, you're the kid from the Santa Monica College shooting. I don't want that. I want to be known, hopefully in 30 years, oh, you're the guy on ABC News as the nightly news anchor, something positive. I'm glad I told my story. I'm glad I got up in front of those cameras. But when I say 15 minutes of fame, it was more 15 minutes of infamy. I didn't enjoy it, but I had to do it. Just something inside of me said, you got to do this.
Is there anything that would have made it easier for you? Like, especially when we're talking about the immediate aftermath, when you come out, there's all those reporters, like you describing how you're being pulled side to side, like, okay, now we need you here. Now we need you here. Like that is just, I've seen that happen. I've seen it happen. So I understand it as a journalist, and it's awful, but it just feels so wrong because we're not talking about somebody who's running for political office. Okay, now we need to give you an interview here. You need to give an interview here. We're talking about somebody who just experienced a trauma. Like, have you thought about whether there might've been a better way, or in an ideal world, we can be as fantastical as we want here. Like, what would have made your life easier for somebody who felt the duty to share your story, but to not have further trauma added on top of it?
One of the things that the last couple of months I've been thinking about is, in a perfect world, why don't we have deployment teams, if you will, from the university or from these schools? It's sad that we have to get to this point, of immediate resources that are available right then and there. And this is something that's actually deeply bothered me. Not one time has my university reached out to me and been like, hey, Brett, you're a valued alum. We know what you went through. What's going on? How can we tell your story? How can we support you? Not one time have they reached out to me. I had my professor that day from the final I was going to take. He reached out to me. I had lunch with him actually the very next day after the shooting, which was very nice, but no note from the president, the dean, nothing. And that, I think, more so than the media, I think that is an obligation and a duty and a moral obligation on the universities to actually reach out to these people that go through these shootings when it's associated with, a certain building or group or university, college, school, to check up on these people.
What sort of
resources allocated towards that?
Yeah. So what sort of immediate resources do you think would have been helpful to you? Like if you were at the school for like 2 hours after it happened, right? Doing these interviews, if somebody were to sweep in and say, Brett, we're here to give you what you need. Like, what would that have looked like, do you think?
I think, and this could be kind of almost like a PR move, almost in a way, in a positive manner, if they were to gather us students up that just saw these horrific things and just almost like corral us almost in a way, and talk to us about, hey, this is what we know. What did you guys see? So we can get all of our facts straight and grieve what just happened. So that way, maybe someone saw something else, and get all of these facts straight. So that way we could possibly even work with law enforcement and the right jurisdictions, the right groups of people, to actually come to a consensus on what just happened. How do we move forward from this as a group? Instead of all of us just being individualized and we all have to kind of just scatter about.
Fend for yourselves.
And fend for yourselves. Now, again, with this horrible event in Texas with these elementary school students, again, very different. They're minors, they're little. Arguably, they probably need more resources than adults because they can't really rationalize what just happened. But there's got to be a way to allocate resources, whether it's the counties, the cities, the school districts, the states, the Fed. I mean, there's got to be a way to gather people up after these horrific events and say, what just happened? What does everyone know? What did you see? Here are the resources available to you, and we're here to support you. I think that type of that type of community gathering would be so helpful for the healing of these universities, these towns that go through these horrific events. Very similar to a church. There was a church shooting in Iowa a couple days ago, and the church immediately said, "We've got services available. We've got counselors. Let us know how we can help." If we could get that to a grander scale for students and for people that go through these things, I think we'd be in a much better place.
Make it the expectation rather than the exception. Have these
Absolutely.
things in place.
If, let's say, town A had a policy and everyone knew it, if something big happens, everyone that night or the following day meets at town hall at 9 o'clock in the morning and let's all figure this out. I think it'd be great. And everyone could show up with, whether it's food, whether it's, mental health services, whether it's the FBI, in case they need to get additional information. There could be so much good that comes out of a bad situation if we all just come together and help each other grieve and move past these things and gather our resources rather than immediately point fingers and say, if this wasn't for you guys, like it wasn't for Republicans or Democrats. And that's unfortunately exactly where we're at.
So political. You also described, Brett, in your blog, you went home after that 2.5-mile walk and you did another interview when you got home. You broke down, you went to bed, and then you got a call at, was it 4 in the morning? 4 a.m. Who was it that was calling you at 4 a.m.?
It was the affiliate. It was this, I think it was a local affiliate in Atlanta. And what's really interesting is that they had told me, we're going to call you. They told me the day that it happened, we're going to call you tomorrow morning at 4 a.m. I knew that it was coming, but I forgot to set my alarm and I woke up at 3:57. It's like my internal body clock knew. I literally woke up and they were ringing and I stepped outside and took the call for 15, I think it was 10, 15 minutes. And, that was it, which now looking back on it is extremely rude. Like, hey, when works best for you? We know you just went through everything. Like, we'd love to interview you. What time is reasonable for you after you went through this? Oh, 8:30 in the morning works for me. I usually get up at 8. Perfect. We'll call you then. Not, hey, we're going to call you at 4 a.m. I probably should have just ignored them.
This was a news outlet that had already interviewed you.
Yes.
So could they not have just used that interview that they already did? Like that's one of the things that I think the news media needs to wrap their heads around is you don't need to keep taking and taking and taking. Like if you've already taken, then just use that. Like when we're thinking about how we can minimize harm, that seems like a classic example of, we don't need to do this interview with this guy at 4 o'clock in the morning tomorrow because he's actually already just talked to us.
And in that corral group that I was kind of describing, to kind of make a sports metaphor, after a game, you line up the key players, and you ask them questions about the game, who scored the most points, what have you, you interview the coach, in that group of immediate healing and gathering resources, there could be, some sort of supervisor or aide or manager or someone of authority from the school to say, hey, the media wants to talk to a few people, like who is in that place to do that? Essentially put them in one spot. The media can ask their questions and then you move on. Instead of getting pulled. And I retold my story 30 plus times. And by the end of the day, my voice was raspy, so there's gotta be a better way to hash out these extremely important details that have to be told one way or another in a less harmful manner and less like piranhas.
Like
piranhas. That's kind of what it felt like. It's just like they're just nipping at you and grabbing any piece of meat possible. And I volunteered to do that, so that's what I threw myself into. But there's, in journalism school, they teach us ethics. There's got to be a more ethically sound way to do these things that is centered around the community or the city, that is more organized rather than just this manic free-for-all.
Because you keep saying that you volunteered, you consented to these, but you were still you were in a traumatic state. You had just experienced this traumatic event. So I don't think that we can put it all on the survivor to say, okay, yeah, I'm good to go. And then just keep taking. Like, I think I'm sensing from you that you agree that there should be a responsibility on the part of the journalist to know when to stop pushing or to do it in a better way.
Absolutely. And, you and I were, discussing over email, it's really stuck in my head that Anderson Cooper was in Uvalde, Texas, last week or 2 weeks ago. And the way that he was so comforting to that dad that found out that his daughter had passed away, like, was very touching, the fact that he had his hand on his shoulder and, he was asking him questions as a journalist should, but he was acting like a decent human being at the same time and not so black and white. And, I'm the reporter, I'm just doing my job and I'm going to get out of here. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I guess, it comes to every individual how much they want to emotionally connect with the person that they're interviewing. But I think, again, going back to ethics, that journalists, when these mass casualties happen that everyone can relate to, has an obligation to connect on some level, and make that person feel better. Not be their therapist, because, again, journalists are not trained to be therapists, but there's got to be a way, because, again, if the shoe was on the other foot after an interview, I would have given Brett a huge hug and be like, dude, I'm sorry. Like, this really sucks. And that would have been really nice to have.
Do you remember feeling any empathy in those moments during all those interviews?
Zero. There was no empathy. It was, we need to get the story and do it now. And I remember the journalists kind of started leaving the scene, and I was just kind of just like left in the dust, like, okay, what do I do now? Again, my car's on campus, my laptop, my keys, like, all I had was, luckily I grabbed my cell phone. And to add on to that, not only was, these journalists pulling me back and forth, I mean, literally, like, the seconds between interviews, I was getting phone calls from radio stations, I was getting phone calls from family members, my social media was blowing up. I mean, I was the most popular person on the planet for a good 5-10 minutes. That's what it felt like.
Did you enjoy it in the moment? Like, I don't know if enjoy is the right word, but like, what was it like in the moment? Because you've described pretty well how you felt after it all ended, but what was it like in that moment?
I felt proud of myself for stepping up the way that I did and telling the story as well as I did. I definitely stuttered in a few interviews and wasn't, my picture perfect camera ready self. Very obviously so, given the situation, but I was very proud of myself, and I still am. The fact that I had to fear for my life within the own four walls of my school, and then have a police officer literally, I was staring down the chamber of his gun. For someone to shake that off and get in front of, millions of people on live television, I mean, that's pretty admirable, I'd say. And that's why I admire, so many of these people that step up after these, horrific events and actually get out there and talk about it. It's extremely hard. I've had years of survivor's guilt. I've heard stories of people having survivor's guilt and end up committing suicide. Like, I get it. I'm not at that point, but I get it. Why was the lady that was just picking cans up off campus to make an extra couple bucks, why was she killed? Like, she wasn't doing anything wrong. So, it's been an interesting journey, 9 years to the day. But I'm really glad that, that we connected, and I'm glad that I get to tell this story, because, there isn't enough empathy in media. It's, how can we connect this to politics? How can we make this as big as possible and radicalize it, if you will, to ensure we get more, viewers or page views? I mean, CNN just is laying back on their breaking news banner. Good. We shouldn't over sensationalize what happened in Texas. 100% that's breaking news. But some of these other events, I don't think everything's breaking news.
Or as things develop, and breaking news. And I think that has an impact on not only survivors, but like the general public. It gets our amygdala firing. Like, we all kind of, I mean, research has shown that the general public that consumes the media coverage, especially these mass violence incidents, that they are even at an increased risk of experiencing PTSD just from the repeated exposure to these events. I want to touch on something that you just mentioned, Brett, because the people watching or listening wouldn't have realized this, even though we talked about it offline. But today is the 9-year anniversary. And when I realized that, you brought it to my attention the other day, I said, like, absolutely, we can do this another day. And you said you're okay to do it today. But can you give us a little bit of insight, if you're comfortable doing so, on, I guess, the experience of a mass violence survivor all these years later? What is today like for you? Like, what are you feeling today that you might not necessarily be feeling on other days? Because this is also a day that journalists would be reaching out to people. It's the anniversary. We got to get that interview. Like, what is it like for you today?
I think for me today, And again, being in the wake of these recent events in the United States and President Biden coming up and making a, very politically charged statement of we need to come to a consensus and solve this, which I totally agree with. And I think his speech was great. It's when those headlines come up, it's definitely a constant reminder, but I don't think about it on a daily basis by any means. However, I went to my girlfriend's niece's dance recital a couple nights ago. Room probably had 2,000 people in it. It was extremely dark. I knew exactly where their emergency exits were. I was farthest away from them. Definitely had a little bit of anxiety and worry. Definitely would have made me feel better if I had a concealed carry. In that moment, I thought, I wish I had a gun just in case. And so, yeah, it's, certain events definitely make me a little bit edgy, mass gatherings, but then I'll go to a college football game and I'm so into the game that I just don't even think about it. So it's very situational. But I think the lasting wound is continuing to see this happen over and over again. And my own political beliefs constantly get, battled against. And not that I live by my political beliefs, but for me to sit here and say that, I'm pro firearm, but then look what's happening in this country. Is this the way that we need to be living? And then I go back to it and look at my own lens. That guy created it from scratch. We as a country cannot fix that. The only thing we can fix is defending ourselves. And then it gets into this whole tailspin and it's exhausting. Like how to fix this is, I don't know how we're going to do it. But, my girlfriend working in a hospital, and there was that recent hospital shooting over, a patient being angry at his doctor. She says, even aside from dating me, that exact situation has been a massive fear of hers. Patients being angry that they didn't get the right care and they come in and just decide to kill someone. So, it's, there's constant reminders, but it's not something I think about on a daily basis. But, would I take it back? Honestly, no, I don't think I would, because I think a lot of personal development has come from it. And I think a lot of critical thinking has come from it. And I now know confidently that if a bad situation happens and I find myself in it, that I can get myself out.
Wow. That's a really powerful thought to think of. I love hearing that. You had ended that blog post that I was referring to. You had ended it with the line, let's just remember what people are going through when these tragedies happen. What is it, Brett, that you want journalists, survivor support workers, the general public to know about the experience of being a mass violence survivor?
Oh, you got, excuse me, you got me a little teary-eyed hearing that. I think we all just need to remember that this isn't all politics. It's just not, because as long as human beings have been alive, we've been killing each other out of anger, out of accident. People will continue to die in not so great circumstances. And there's just so much damage that is done from these events that isn't just, oh my gosh, my cousin, my sister, my best friend died in a mass shooting. We're going to bury them and I guess it's time to move on. And that's just not reality. This stuff goes on for years and years and years and years afterward. And we all need to be more empathetic, absolutely, to the people that go through this stuff, and also people that have differing opinions. I've had several people say, how could you, still be, have this certain belief system when you've had a gun pointed in your face? And I'm just like, how in the hell is that empathetic? That's not like, you have no idea what I went through. You never cared to ask. You just want to hear what my political belief is on how we're going to fix it. But before we fix it, let's address the problem. How are you doing? What's going on? Have you sought therapy? Are you still experiencing signs of post-traumatic stress disorder? Are you scared to go out in public? Are you scared to be in large gatherings? Someone could ask me that all day long. I'm less hesitant to have the political conversation because it unfortunately goes nowhere. I still stand firmly that people should have the right to defend themselves. Other people don't, and that's okay. Everyone has their own belief systems. But we all just need to take a massive step back and be way more empathetic as a world. That's really the solution.
Did journalists ask you about the gun stuff the day of? Do you
No.
recall?
I don't think at that point that gun ownership was as polarizing as it
Right.
is now. Truthfully, I think Parkland did a lot of it. And as more of these happen, I think Sandy Hook, the elementary school. I mean, again, not to say that it matters more when little kids get hurt, but of course that's more grabby and more emotional when little kids are getting hurt. So I think when these events happen, people want to immediately draw conclusions of why did this happen. But when you're at a college, it's all adults, so it's not as like, oh my gosh. So.
Do you, one other question I meant to ask you was, because I often talk to people about the impact that trauma has on the brain, and sometimes it can impact the way people recall incidents, traumatic incidents. Do you remember, like, or has your recollection of events changed at all over the years versus what you were saying in those interviews in the immediate aftermath?
It's really funny. Generally speaking, and for no good reason, I actually have a very terrible memory. I don't remember very well. Maybe I'm a little lazy. I don't know. But that day has stuck with me. Like I could replay it in my head as if it happened yesterday. With the type of therapy that I've done, it's called EMDR. I'm sure you're familiar.
Yeah. I've done it.
Yep. What I do is essentially I hold these two vibrating paddles in my hand and they buzz back and forth. And I've gone to therapists that I've worked with, guys in the military, and they tell me to play every single second in my head. And I would just sit there and sob and sob and sob. And I basically just was like a wet towel and I just wringed myself out. But no, I remember it truthfully like it was yesterday. And yeah, it's a haunting memory for sure. And ironically, it's not as haunting if I go moment by moment. When the police officer pointed the gun at me, it was more haunting of not knowing what was going to happen when I immediately threw, this gal Audra in the study room, and I jumped in there. I remember just texting my grandfather saying, "Hey, turn on the news. There's a mass shooter at my school," and immediately started calling 911. And just that 15 minutes that felt like 5 hours of just sitting there waiting. What's going on? And then immediately as the police officer ironically pointed the gun at me, I'm like, okay, we're good. Ironically.
Maybe because it was a police officer, who knows? And I wonder too, if like your very clear memory of events, if that has anything to do with the fact that you told your story so many times over and over again in the immediate aftermath. I have no idea. Maybe somebody watching this or listening to this will be saying, no, or maybe, yeah, I have no idea, but I wonder.
Yeah, I've told the story obviously a decent amount of times, and I've written about it, and it comes up in conversation here and there. I just think it's one of those moments that like is so impactful that it's hard to forget. But ironically, as I'm thinking about it in my head now, I remember that more than I remember my college graduation. And college graduation, fun, happy, lively, celebration, positive vibes. And I don't even remember that as well as that shooting. So it's unfortunate, but I'm a better man because of it, and I'm a better journalist because of it. I really believe so.
Tell me a little bit more about that. How does it make you a better journalist, do you think?
So now, in my day-to-day work right now, I talk to people about money. I want to understand money stories. I want to understand where people are coming from. And this is a perfect example. So growing up, I always had a bank account. It wasn't even like a thought, like everyone just gets a bank account. I thought that was my level of privilege. Everyone has a bank account, but come to find out, that's not the case. And I had to swallow a huge pill of humility and realize like not everyone comes from an upper middle class white family that had a vacation house and boats and jet skis. Not everyone has that. And not everyone has that same starting point that I did. And so with financial reporting, while it may not be traumatic like a mass shooting, but there are financial traumas too. Like, recently, and I don't think I disclosed this to you, I went through a divorce last year, and that is immensely traumatic, emotionally traumatic, financially traumatic, spiritually traumatic, literally physically traumatic too. So there's more levels to trauma than someone pointing a gun in your face or fearing for your life. And that's a huge thing that I've learned, in the last 18 months.
It's really taught you a lot of empathy by the sounds of it, in all different parts of life.
Absolutely. Yeah. specifically to what I'm working on now, realizing that not everyone has that same level of opportunity, not realizing that, not everyone starts with, a credit card in their hand like I did at 18 years old. And some people have more barriers to jump through, has definitely been part of my reporting. And I try to always remind myself that, when I'm talking about investing for the future or saving for retirement, some people can't even afford to put gas in their tank. Like, we need to take a huge step back and, how do you just get by day to day? Because unfortunately, that's where we're at financially as a country. People can't get by. And that's a level of trauma. And that will go on for generations. And it's been proven.
And you think that your own traumatic events sort of helped open your eyes or helped take this more empathetic approach to these sorts of stories?
Absolutely. Because, not to knock my parents by any means, but I don't believe I grew up in a very empathetic home. And so I've had to teach myself empathy, especially being a journalist. We're grown to understand people's stories and where they're coming from and what is the grander perspective of things. And, when you're a 19-year-old kid and, you've got a, 2-parent household, all of these privileges, you don't really care to know or realize what's going on around you. And now into my 20s, having traveled the world, reported on a ton of different stories, reporting on a mass shooting of my own, it really opens up your eyes to the type of crap that people are dealing with.
You reported on another mass shooting? You like,
the one that I would,
right.
But also as a reporter reading about all of these different mass shootings and, correlating to mass shootings, not everyone believes that owning a gun is a good thing. And not everyone believes that we have a right to bear arms, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Everyone has their reasons as to why, and some of them are probably pretty legitimate. So it makes, I think us as reporters, our job is to swallow a big pill of humility and realize that, if you come from even a slight level of privilege, that there's a lot of people out there that don't.
All right. Brett, is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we haven't touched on yet?
You rang me out like a wet rag for sure.
No, I don't like to hear that.
No, in a good way.
I want to leave you feeling good about this conversation,
this is all good. It's getting it out there. And that's my larger point, is that we need to figure out how to be open-minded and have open conversations without it always leading to politics. Whether it's the abortion stuff that's going on in the United States, gun control, taxes, all of this stuff, we just need to be more open, not point the fingers, point blame, and not live in this tribalist society where, I'm Republican, you're Democrat, we're not friends. That doesn't get us anywhere. Let's open up with our stories, have a conversation. But at the end of the day, that's too much work. It's really easy to point fingers and talk trash on Twitter, but it's really hard to sit down, have a cup of coffee with someone and say, you've got a differing opinion, I want to hear it, and why.
How big of a role do you think the media plays in that divisiveness?
Big part. And again, very transparently, even though I am a reporter, again, like we were talking about offline, you can look up someone's voting party. I'm a registered Republican, but when I sit here and watch Fox News, I want to throw up. It's crap. It doesn't actually serve any real purpose. And it's the same thing with, some of the other mainstream medias out there. I mean, it's just not the news anymore. It is an elevated talk show on whatever political spectrum you want to be on. And, the namesake of my school, the Walter Cronkite School, he stood for objective journalism. I'm going to give you the straight up information and you can do with it what you will. And we have completely lost that as reporters and as media. We have completely lost that narrative because we're motivated by money, we're motivated by business objectives, and it's really upsetting. Truthfully, and I've had to look myself in the mirror and say, what am I doing? As a reporter several times, like, are we actually informing the public of what is happening in their communities and in their country, or are we spitting opinions about why the president is terrible, why the Speaker of the House is terrible, why these laws won't work? And it's just not getting us anywhere. And I mean, I think I would be a fool, and anyone would be a fool in the United States to sit here and say that the media isn't divisive. Even as part of that media, and being in a field that, again, let's call it for what it is, that is largely left-leaning. Most people in the media are left leaning. And for someone that does identify as a conservative, like it is a very hard place to play in. It is a very hard place. But again, as a Republican, I'm more than happy to have those conversations and understand where other people come from. And that's just not, unfortunately, where we're at these days.
And it's interesting. It's interesting to think about like the at what cost on the bigger scale in terms of what things are not getting done because we can't just have conversations, and at the smaller scale, like at what expense when you're taking people and jostling them around, and because you're just trying to get those clicks and everything. It's a lot of food for thought. So I thank you for that, Brett. Anything else that you would like to add?
Everyone just needs to be nicer to each other. That's it. We all need to really just suck it up and be nice and smile at people and say, have a good day.
And go watch a water polo game, maybe.
Yep, exactly. We all just need to just get in the pool and just beat the crap out of each other. Maybe then we'd feel better.
Yeah. I guess the water polo is not the best example.
Yeah, exactly.
Anybody listening, anybody watching who has not seen a water polo game, I think that they even say that it is more hardcore than rugby, if I remember.
It is.
Or it's one of the top three, right?
This is a whole nother podcast. I'm a firm believer. Please slide into my DMs if you feel differently. Water polo is the second hardest sport in the world, next to boxing, MMA, where it's like direct impact fighting.
Yeah.
For anyone that doesn't know about water polo, basically people are intentionally trying to drown you and beat you up in the process, and you can't touch the bottom of the pool. So
and it all goes on under the surface. Yeah,
exactly.
You can't see. My son, actually, who is 7 at the time of this recording, he was recently asking me about water polo. He's like, but you can touch the ground, right? Like, no. It's like, then what do you do? I'm like, you're treading water and you're swimming back and forth and he was like, wow. I'm like, yeah, wow, that's right.
Yeah. And a lot of people don't know it's one of the oldest Olympic sports, and it's a great sport for anyone out there in the United States. It's a growing sport. I'm a big proponent of youth water polo. Our men's team hasn't been up to speed. Our women's team is fantastic. I mean, they crush it. They are such a great squad to watch. But yeah, let's leave this on a positive note. Everyone should go watch some water polo.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much, Brett.
Sure.